Jedediah, what they don't realize, when you give the government an inch, you never get it back. It goes the extra length. And before you know it, they're not only using it against the bad guy, they're using it against their enemies or people that they don't like. That's what's happening now. And it's so dangerous. I want to sound the alarm to people in a certain way. It's so dangerous. Hey everyone, welcome to another Sit Down with Michael Franzese. Hope everybody is doing well. All is very good and blessed on this end. And as always, we give God all the praise, honor, and glory for that. Even if it wasn't that great, I still give him praise, honor, and glory because God has a plan for all of us ultimately. Anyway, today I have a very interesting guest. As you know, just about everybody I've interviewed in the past, they've all been men. You know, my audience is mainly men, something like 93%. I did interview Mikhaila Peterson at one point in time, and today I have a very interesting guest. Her name is Jedediah Bila. She was once on The View. Now she's part of Valuetainment, Patrick Bet-David. She works alongside with him in many, many ways, and decided to have her on the show. Very strong, independent, intelligent women, something I like because I'm surrounded in my household by strong, intelligent, and independent women. So she has some great views on some things that we're going to talk about. Hopefully you're going to enjoy it. Let's get right into Jedediah Bila. So I want to talk to you about just things that affect our everyday lives. You know, I've watched some of your podcasts. I know what you're about in many ways. But things that are important to me, and I think they're important people, to finally get a woman's point of view on my podcast. So first thing I want to get into is Andrew Tate a little bit. And here's what I want to say. I saw your reaction to Patrick's interview, which I thought was great. I thought he cleared a lot of things up in that interview because I do think he got a bad rap on so many things with, you know, being canceled all over the place, which I can't stand. But I got to ask you this. Why is it that women seem to be offended, some women, when men just try to tell men how to be men? Why does it have to bleed over to a woman's feelings or affect them or impact them in a negative way? I don't get that.
Well, I think that women, in large part, modern women, and by that I mean particularly young women in their 20s, have been heavily brainwashed, unfortunately, by modern feminism. And they've been taught that, you know, signs of female empowerment are promiscuity and sleeping around. And, you know, that's a positive thing for women. And they've been taught a lot about toxic masculinity and been brainwashed to think that sometimes when men are just being men, as in protectors, as in physically strong, as in unapologetically masculine, able to defend themselves, someone who wants to be the man of the house, someone who wants to take care of the family financially, someone who has the audacity to say, I'd love for a woman to stay at home. They don't have to, but I'd love that because I think it's really important for, you know, a mom to play a large part in raising kids. You know, that's just a personal preference that some men feel and vocalize. And I think a lot of women have been brainwashed to think that that's all bad and going to hurt them in some way. Like that's going to bring them back to that 1950s housewife stereotype that they've been told was bad and that they were told modern feminism came to rescue you from that. So they're hardwired to just, you know, emotionally react to a guy like Andrew Tate, who's out there in large part not talking about relationships, by the way, talking about, you know, self-defense and talking about, you know, getting in the gym and taking care of yourself and battling depression and you own your own life and all of these things. And I think they see him as deeply threatening to a structure that they've been told is ideal for women, a modern feminist structure, where women essentially become men in many respects. They act like men. There's no distinction between men and women. And ultimately, I think that structure makes a lot of women very unhappy because they're not men and we're wired differently. Not to say women, you know, can't get out there and work and do all these things, but we're just different from men. And I think they hate him because a lot of what he's saying is true. And it breaks down a lot of the tenets of modern feminism that they've been told are truths and displays them as lies, which they are.
And I think you're right on. But let me ask you this. If you think those same women were to meet a man that acts like a man, and in acting like a man, I think you elevate women in a lot of ways. You know, I like to think I'm old school. My father brought me up to be a certain way, respect women. And I have 5 daughters, all very, very independent, all very strong. They can make it on their own, but they want a man to treat them like a woman. And do you think those same women that are listening to Andrew Tate, if they were to meet somebody that qualifies as a real man, old school type of man, do you think that they would react the same way, or they might say, hey, you know what? This isn't so bad after all?
So I think women want a gentleman. They absolutely want a gentleman. And I've covered this extensively, looking at asking women what they really want. And they talk about how they want a guy who makes 6 figures, and they want a guy who, you know, acts like a gentleman and opens the doors and is respectful and, you know, gives his seat up for an old lady on a bus and all of those things. I think the problem with Andrew Tate is that a lot of his, and he's talked about this, you know, how a lot of his content was chopped up. And we live in an age now where in order to get these clicks on YouTube, on TikTok, everywhere, you kind of take these long form conversations and you clip them down. And I think he made some mistakes early on where he didn't realize, well, let me be really conscious of how I'm saying these things because they can get clipped up. Now, could he have been trapped in some of these moments anyway? Sure. Listen, somebody can look at my interview with you today and chop it up and try to make me look bad. And they'll do it if they want to. They'll piece this together and edit that. But I think that ultimately what offends people about Andrew is that Andrew seems to, and I don't know him personally, but he seems to not care what anybody thinks of him. Mm-hmm. He's like, I'm here and I'm saying unpopular truths. And you may not like what I'm saying, but a lot of it is true. And he's right. A lot of what he says is true. And your initial reaction as a woman sometimes is to have that emotional reaction. I, for one, listened to him in particular in the beginning. And I'm somebody who didn't live my life. You know, I wasn't promiscuous. I wasn't raised that way. I was like a serial monogamist, and I listened to the content and I had a gut reaction where I was like, oh, who is this guy? I watched a lot of short form content. What is he saying? You know, then I went in and dug into it and did my research. And I said, oh, I see what he's saying. This is actually absolutely true. It may not be a reality that I like or that I fall into. Like, he's not talking about me, but he is talking about modern women. And there's some truth to this. And I think a lot of those women that fall into that bracket, like maybe they did or are living a promiscuous life, and he's outright saying, hey, this is going to make you less attractive to men. They don't want to hear it. They don't want to hear it. And they also don't believe it to be true because Gloria Steinem and the modern feminists after her told women that's not true, because they needed women to be promiscuous in order to get their feminist agenda out there. And what is that agenda? That's a pro-abortion, pro-promiscuity movement. So I think ultimately women do naturally, instinctively want a gentleman, though. And I think a lot of what he's really saying, if you listen to him, is be a man. Men, be men. Be, you know, strong and, you know, protective, and be someone that, you know, can defend your home and, you know, be that shoulder to cry on, but, you know, don't sink as a man in those moments because she's going to need to lean on you. And I think women really want that. But modern women are often afraid to admit that because it goes against so much of what they're being indoctrinated with in 2022.
Yeah, I think you're right on with that. And you think this whole thing started with Gloria Steinem way back when, and started this whole movement that somehow, I don't know how these movements catch on, and then even though they might be in the minority, you view them as they're in the majority, that this is what people are really thinking all over. And I agree. I mean, I've spoken to women in my own family, you know, not necessarily my daughters, but, you know, neighbors and friends, and, you know, they all have they have what you just described. They want to see guys be guys and be gentlemen. And I just don't understand how minority things appear to be major. Like this is what everybody's thinking, and this is what everybody wants to do, and we have to cow down to this type of mindset and behavior. It drives me crazy, Jedediah. I'll be honest with you, but I think you're right. But one thing I disagree with him on, I think you do too, when he said women shouldn't defend themselves physically, shouldn't learn how to defend themselves. I totally disagree with that. I have 5 daughters. I know how it's going on in New York. 2 of my daughters are in New York, and I have 3 of them out here, and I'm telling them all the time, you're in a parking lot, make sure you have pepper spray, make sure you know what to do. I even teach them little techniques. A woman has to defend herself in this day and age, and I don't know where he came up with that. I mean, obviously, if you get a guy like him, it's going to be difficult, but that's not the normal guy. It's going to be difficult for a guy like me with a guy like him. But, but that's not the normal guy out there. Women have to defend themselves today.
Yeah, I would love to ask him about that. I'm working on getting an interview with him. And I would love to ask him what the content before that clip and after looked like. But I'm a big proponent of women taking self-defense classes. I'm a strong Second Amendment supporter because I believe that a gun is an equalizer for a woman. I'm small. I'm not even 5'5". I do work out. I am fit, but put me against your average guy, he's going to be bigger than I am by a lot. Mm-hmm. I took Krav Maga, I took boxing. And I think we just live in a scary world. So do I think that it's realistic that your average woman is going to come against, your average man in a bad situation and she's going to, have an easy time of it? No. Do I think if she has some training and she, has the mace or she has, a gun, she's a law-abiding citizen and has a gun, do I think that she absolutely has a better shot of getting out of there and not getting 100%? So you have to give yourself the best odds. I don't know where he was coming at with that. But as far as I can see, it does women no favors to not be prepared, right? Because the average guy walking around is not Andrew Tate. That guy, oftentimes guys who seek to do harm too, assume that they're going to have a really easy time with a woman. Oh, she's not going to know what to do in this situation. A lot of times their balance is terrible. A lot of times they don't know how to fight. So they're bigger and stronger, but they don't know how to do any of those things. So if a woman is taught some key moves, that may enable her to get the heck out of there. No, I'm not looking for a prolonged fight between a man and a woman. That's not going to serve a woman. She's probably going to have, a poor outcome in that. But if you can get the right kick in or the right, whatever you need to do to get out of there, I fully support that. I think, knowing what I know about him now and looking at so much long form content, I'm curious if his message was, don't be deluded, don't be deluded about the, don't get this inflated sense of self where you think you're Sarah Connor from the Terminator suddenly, don't try to fight it out and, really know that you're smaller and know that odds are against you. So get the heck out of there if you can. I would be curious to ask him, but I'm a strong proponent of, listen, like New York City is horrible right now in terms of crime, and it does women no favors to not be prepared for whatever they may encounter on this street or the next street.
Yeah, I think if you explained it to him like you just did, I think when he's looking at that, he's looking at himself against any woman. And of course, like I said, himself against most any man would be a terrible matchup. So yeah, but I totally agree with that. This whole cancel culture that affected him in such a bad way, do you think there's any point in time, other than when it maybe jeopardizes someone's life, do you think that cancel culture can be justified in any way, shape, or form? Are there any exceptions?
No, because I believe that speech is good. Ideas are good. And you don't have to agree with everything that someone says. Like, who cares? I just feel like we're a nation of babies now, where we see something we don't like. We see something where someone that says something that makes us uncomfortable. And our knee-jerk reaction in many cases, not mine, not yours, but way too many people, particularly of the younger generation, is they're making me feel bad. Remove them, block them, censor them, label them misinformation, whatever you need to do to shut them down. And that's bad, and I always say to people, particularly with Tate, if you don't like what he's saying, okay, he's saying that's fine. He's okay with it. Go make your own video and explain why he's wrong. Go make your own content negating the message that he's putting out there. Don't try to shut him down. Make your voice louder. So it just doesn't serve anyone. And it's getting to be where comedy is dying. You know, quality television is dying because everyone's so afraid of offending someone, and the content is just getting boring. You know, I don't even watch television anymore. It's like, why would I? You know, even the news media, you can't even report a story properly because you have to walk on tiptoes around this and that and who you might offend. So I don't think it does any favors to society to create a nation of wimps that whose instinct is to shut someone down just because they don't like what they're saying. Like, where's everyone's backbone? So no, I don't support cancel culture at all. Let bad ideas die by debating them. And if you're not going to debate them, it's probably because you're afraid to debate them because your points suck.
Exactly. Do you see the trend changing at all? Do you think people are starting to say, you know what, enough of this? I mean, I was thrilled when Netflix stood up, you know, with the David Chappelle thing, and they said, no, we're keeping them on. And a few of these other, major media spots said no. It seems like there is a trend where it's starting to reverse itself a little bit. And I think as a result of what's going on, people are they've had it.
Yeah, I think that's 100% right, by the way. And I think, the millennials really embraced all of the woke stuff and all of the cancel culture. And they were very coddled growing up. It was very like, put me in my safe space. And the generations that are following are tired of that. I think because people realize, oh, maybe this works out well if it's somebody I don't like, but it could be me next. Mm-hmm. And they've just seen so many people, banned on social media, or, you can't just even have a conversation or a debate anymore without, big tech or whoever it is stepping in and being like, this opinion needs to go away. And people are starting to feel like, well, it could be their opinion today, but it could be my opinion tomorrow. So I think that the unifying force now is like, just let people say their stuff. Let them say as long as they're not hurting anyone physically, there's no violence involved. There's nothing crazy going on. I always say about Tate, I'm like, why was this guy banned? Because people didn't like his opinion. That's all. That's the only reason that he was banned. So that's deeply disturbing to me, especially because there's a bunch of man-hating feminists online whose content is fine and sitting there and undisturbed because they fell in line with what, the powers that be in 2022 decide are talking points people are allowed to hear. And Andrew Tate didn't fall in line with that. So I always say, like, you don't like Tate, it could be Tate today and it's you tomorrow. So don't rush to defend censorship because it could easily apply to you as well.
Yeah, and I think I read some things where, they were trying to stretch what he said to say it could be dangerous to women because you're teaching men. I mean, it was so insane. I mean, people stretch so far to try to, get their point across, which I don't even know if they know what their point is. They're just disagreeing. It got so bad here in California. If I'm interpreting the law right, our governor just signed something into law that says if a family doctor disagrees with something that the government is saying about vaccination, COVID, or whatever, he's potentially could be fined or committing a crime. If he, through his own research, disagrees or says, no, that's wrong what the government is saying, he could be held accountable and responsible for it. I mean, that's how far some of these people are stretching this. And people don't realize, look, I got to ask you this. What section of Brooklyn did you grow up in?
So I grew up, my grandparents, I was born in Brooklyn. I was born in Park Slope, and my grandparents lived there. And so I was back and forth between Staten Island and Brooklyn a lot growing up, but Park Slope was the hood.
Okay. Hot spots, a lot of mob guys during that time. You know that. I mean, I grew up in Williamsburg, Greenpoint. Did you ever meet up with any experiences?
No. I don't, but my mom grew up on DeGraw Street. Yeah, she was like friends with some guys, in the mob. That was just like, what was happening in Brooklyn at the time. So she just grew up with some of those guys. Well, so my generation, like I was removed from it because by that time we moved to Staten Island and it was so removed from her life that she started with my dad at that point. But growing up, yeah, she told me a bunch of stories, which is why it's always funny. And my whole family is so Italian that like people are always like, oh, did you see My Cousin Vinny? Or I'm like, I lived My Cousin Vinny. I don't need to watch it. That's my house. So
yes. But, the reason I ask you because, well, first of all, up until the mid 80s, the mob presence was so out there at that time. You know, that was during my era, but it's calmed down a lot. Fortunately, a lot of guys went undercover now, so they're not, you know, targets like they were when we were running the streets. But the reason I say this, you know, when it comes to overreach like that, I'm going to get into a little bit of, we can call it politics, but you know, politics are politics in Washington and in the state houses and all of that. But what's happening on the street as a result of those politics are just everyday issues that we have to deal with. So when people call you getting into politics, no, I'm getting to everyday issues. And one of them is, look, I understand government overreach. I understand the FBI. I mean, I've been arrested 18 times. I've been to trial 5 times. I had 2 federal indictments, one brought on by Giuliani. So, and I know that the government plays games. But, you know, when they overreach with mob guys, at least in their minds, and people say, well, you know, it's justified. These are bad guys. They're on the street. They're doing their thing. And I can somewhat understand that, okay? You let the government do their thing, because what they don't realize is that the government has so many tools and so many weapons to go after you. If they can't do it the right way, well, they're just screwing up. They're just not effective. They're not using the laws and the arsenal of the weapons they have properly. But what I'm seeing now, you know, and again, this is a little political, I have never in my lifetime witnessed the audacity in an agency like the FBI, how politicized it's become, how our government is now utilizing them as an arm of this administration to go after people. And you know, Jedediah, what they don't realize, when you give the government an inch, you never get it back. It goes the extra length. And before you know it, they're not only using it against the bad guy, they're using it against their enemies or people that they don't like. That's what's happening now. And it's so dangerous. I want to sound the alarm to people in a certain way. It's so dangerous.
Yeah, it's completely weaponized. I mean, I had covered a story about a pro-life activist. I don't know if you saw that story, but there was a guy, pro-life activist, who had an encounter at a Planned Parenthood clinic. Apparently, you know, allegedly the Planned Parenthood clinic representative had gotten in his son's face, and it led to a very minor altercation. He wound up pushing the worker, nothing, done. And he winds up with, you know, months later, he winds up with FBI guys in full gear showing up at his house. I think he has 7 kids. And he's like, what's going on here? You know, this was something that was dismissed repeatedly in local courts, settled, done, over, you know, a local matter. But they needed to make a spectacle of it because they needed to let pro-lifers know, we're watching you. We don't like what you're doing. You know, did they go after, you know, the individuals who are pro-choice, who set fire to other types of, you know, clinics? No, they didn't, because that wasn't a political argument that they wanted to make. So I think it gets really scary, and people look at the justice system and they say, if this is all, that's what, you know, I talk about a lot when I say the matrix or the system, that it looks like everyone at the top is colluding and holding hands to further an agenda rather than just doing their job. So people in reaction feel powerless many times because they feel like, well, if I can't count on, you know, impartiality from the FBI, and I can't count on the Justice Department to be focused on actual justice, and instead they're focused on targeting political opponents and everything is politicized, where does that leave me? The court system is so heavily politicized. As you know, liberalism has just wrecked the courts to a point where it's just outrageous. So people are now trying to find, where is the justice in the justice system? And it's a big problem. You're right. Because people can a couple of decades ago, you would look back and you would feel some safety and some security, despite what was going on with the politicians. You felt like these other institutions still maintain their integrity. And now it's very clear that they have been completely politicized. So I always tell people, this is why elections matter and elections have consequences, because you have to get out there and vote. It does make a big difference. And we can argue here, are there corrupt Republicans? Of course. Republicans oftentimes are asleep at the wheel when it comes to fighting for freedom, but there is still a big difference in terms of Democrats and Republicans. There is still a difference. And liberalism at its core is wrecking, in my view, so much of the country. So I say, start at your community level. and care about these things, vote, care about these things. And if you want integrity restored to these systems, then you have to vote people in who will then put people in positions of power who care about these institutions remaining nonpartisan.
Yeah, I love that. And I agree with everything. Obviously we both lean conservative or are conservative. I'm very conservative in that regard. But, some of the things I just can't understand or process how other people think and why. How do you explain Governor Hochul in New York? I don't even remember her name, the mayor of Chicago, that I think there's something mentally and emotionally wrong with her. How do you explain their position? And me being an ex-criminal, an ex-offender, them being so protective of criminals, so light and easy on crime. To what advantage does this give them? And it's not only the women, I'm just pointing those women out because I'm talking to a woman, but guys too, all over the country. Yeah. What advantage do they gain on this? I can't process it. I don't understand it.
Well, the advantage is that they get to wake up the next day and put a big sticker on that says, I'm woke, I'm in the cool club, which is that criminals roam free. And, they're always thinking, give the criminal the benefit of the doubt. And in turn, the civilians suffer, and New York City is a mess right now because you have these liberal DAs that don't care, so you have criminals that are just, they commit a crime, they go in, they're out, 2 seconds, no problem, done. And as a result, you look at the subways, I was in New York City recently. I went for 1 day and I was there for less than 12 hours. I witnessed 3 to 4 crimes, really? An assault, 2 robberies. There's public indecency all over the place. There's guys just roaming around, shooting up, drugs on the streets, naked.
In Manhattan?
Yeah, in Manhattan. By the way, by Central Park. I was on the Upper East Side. I was in Midtown. I've lived all over the city since I was a kid, up until 5 months ago. I was by Central Park. I was in Midtown East, Midtown West, Upper East. These are once good neighborhoods where you could walk, with your kids. I was standing there watching a mom with her 2 daughters not know what to do because there was a guy who was very clearly intoxicated and he was naked. It was all out. And I'm just looking at this like, this is my city. And it's because criminals know they have no consequences. And they also know that individuals, you see these videos of robberies. Well, nobody's armed in New York. They want to tear down your Second Amendment rights. And at the same time, they want to enable criminals to go in and out. Oh, yep. Go right back on the streets with no consequence. So they're just enabling lawlessness and people are afraid to be there, which is why so many people picked up during COVID, brought their businesses to another place and don't want to go back. They're like, what's the incentive? The taxes are extremely high. If there's ever another COVID or anything like that, they're going to lock me down. I'm done. And people aren't going to want to go into these neighborhoods anymore because they're crime infested. I shudder to say this, but these cities need to sink. They really need to sink before they have a chance to reemerge. And I say, Kathy Hochul, go ahead, do what you want to do. Let the you want to ruin New York? Go ahead and do it. And ultimately, maybe that will inspire New Yorkers to vote differently. I don't know. I really think Fidel Castro could get elected as a Democrat in New York. They just look at the D. It's like D, oh, check. I would love to see what would happen actually if a Republican or a conservative minded individual ran as a Democrat and said the same stuff, but ran in the column that said D for Democrat. I'm curious what would happen there. I don't know, but let him sink. I don't think there's another way to climb out of this. That's what happened with Giuliani. It was a mess. You couldn't go to so many neighborhoods in the city, and it sank so low that people were willing to vote Giuliani in. And he came in and like him or hate him, he cleaned up New York.
And I hated him at that point because he tried to put me away for 100 years. But seriously, but I had been away, for years. When I came back, I'll tell you a quick story. I was in jail for 5 years. I get out on parole. I had to go to New York, and I hadn't seen the city. So I was with the marshals. They were driving me to the court we had to go to in Manhattan. And I said, hey, do me a favor. We got some time? They said, yeah. I said, I want a cup of Dunkin' Donuts. I haven't had that in years. And I just want to drive around the city. I haven't been here in a while. I was shocked when I went through Times Square. I said, this is not the same city. It's beautiful. What happened? Giuliani did a great job. There's no question about it as mayor. He really did. But I got to ask you this, but here's the thing I don't understand. Do these people, Harshil, the mayor in Chicago, think that the result of this, that the people that put them in office want to feel less protected, want to be scared on the streets? Don't they realize that that's the ultimate result of these policies that they're putting in place, and that people at one point in time are going to be terrorized and say, hey, this is not how we want to live? How do they think they're going to gain out of this? Is it delusional?
Well, they think that those individuals will vote Democrat no matter what. So, I say the destruction is intentional a lot. And it is in many respects across the spectrum. I think it all becomes really easy to understand when you look at the fact that for a lot of these hard left politicians, destruction is essential for government control to expand. So what you really need is a society of dependence. You need people who are scared. You need, a state where only the police have guns. That's called a police state, by the way. You need, people to not be able to protect and defend themselves and to rely on the state for that. You need people who are more likely to lean on things like food stamps and things. The destruction is intentional from these people, because if you have healthy people who espouse personal responsibility, who can defend and protect themselves, you're going to have autonomy. Those people are going to be less dependent on government. So people need to understand that this whole thing needs to be supported. The system needs to be supported by you being weak, you being unhealthy, you not being able to defend and protect yourself, you being scared. Look at the last 2 years. It's all fear. It's all fear that they utilize to gain increasing levels of control over individuals, whether it was your business, your medical decisions, whatever it was. Fear was utilized as a weapon. So they don't care that people feel unsafe, because people feeling unsafe helps them to further their big government, you are dependent, you need us agenda. It's intentional.
I don't know. It's like the whole defund the police movement. People have said to me, Michael, come on, at one time you hated the police. I said, yeah, that was at one time. I said, until I finally figured out that was the wrong way to think in life. I said, but again, I have a wife, I have 5 daughters. When they walk down the street, I want them to be safe. Who's going to do it? And people ask me, they said, Michael, you got to love the defund the police movement. I said, yeah, I would have loved it 35 years ago. If Giuliani would have came to me and said, hey, Michael, don't worry about it. You can steal and rob all you want. We're not going to give you a high bail. We're not going to charge you with racketeering, and you won't get a lot of jail time. I said, do you think I would have said, well, thank you, Mr. Giuliani, I'm going to go straight now? No, we would have stepped up the criminal activity. But I don't get how I don't understand how they rationalize that doing something like this is going to make the streets safer. And you know what?
Not. We know it's not.
But Jetta, I'm so personally offended by this. You know what? Look, we had certain things that we did on the street. I never glorify the life, and I never say, people were all good guys. We weren't. But there's a certain moral code that you have in life that you're instilled with, It's like drugs. We would never bring drugs into our neighborhood. We weren't allowed to deal with it anyway. But we protected our neighborhood. Women and kids were protected. I just don't understand the mentality of this, how they can endanger people and not even care about it.
Well, and I always get a bit of pushback or skepticism when I say the destruction is intentional. That's actually a very powerful statement, and people will say, "Oh, maybe she's a little, conspiracy theorist." So I ask people, I always say, "Okay, let's just say that's not true. Then why would somebody simultaneously advocate for a defund the police movement, which puts less police on the streets? It makes the time they take to get to you. You have a problem, you pick up the phone, you call 911. It takes a longer time. There's less police available and ready to protect you. And those people want that. And at the same time, they want to take away your Second Amendment rights. Mm-hmm. Where does that leave you? Where does that leave the single mom at home with 2 kids with an intruder at the door that calls the police? There's a delay and she has no means to defend and protect herself. So I always say to people, I didn't come to this conclusion that the destruction is intentional because I'm into conspiracies. I came to the conclusion because I'm paying attention to what's happening, and there's no other explanation for that. There's no explanation for wanting to defund the police and prevent police officers from getting to you in the proper amount of time and take them off the streets, and also prevent you from being a law-abiding citizen with a gun. I mean, I'm sorry, but a social worker, they offer a social worker who is unarmed is not going to do anything to help that single mom when there's an intruder at the door with a gun, because criminals don't obey laws. We know that. So bottom line is, it is intentional. And that's a tough pill to swallow, because you want to believe that regardless, Republican, Democrat, whatever, even though they're politicians, you want to believe that there's some core humanity in there. But a lot of these politicians are politics to the end. So that big government ideology, that hunger for a nation of dependence, that is their religion. That is what they care about. So they need you weak. And I talk a lot about needing to weaken the male population in particular, which is happening, toxic masculinity and all this stuff that's being thrown out at men, and pornography, and, all of this stuff, and the metaverse, and a lot of this is targeted toward men, because they know that a weak male population is a population that is much more susceptible to leaning on big government. And what they want is a nation of dependence. So when I say it's intentional, it is, and it's very hard for people to swallow. But I ask you, just think critically about some of the decisions that are being made. And if the destruction wasn't intentional, then does it make any sense? Just ask yourself.
You're right. And they're intentionally putting people in harm's way to serve their own agenda. And it's all about power and control. There couldn't be any other answer to that. There's nothing you can logically assume other than that. And to me, honestly, that's despicable. The other thing too, and just want to mention this, demasculinizing these young men. These are the guys who are going to go fight in the military. If you're teaching them not to be men, how are they going to pick up a gun and go fight the enemy for us? I mean, it makes no sense what they're doing. None of this really adds up. I have to say this too, because this has been something that's bothering more than almost anything else, and that's the southern border. And the reason I'm so bothered by it, and I've had, personal issues with this, not me, but in my family that were impacted by this. I spoke to 850 drug enforcement agents. I was a keynote speaker about a year ago from the state of Texas. And afterwards, we talked a little bit. We spent a day and a half. And what they told me, Jedediah, is that they're not even getting 10% of the illegal opioids that are coming across the border. Not even 10%. And they went on to show me a block that was about 2 inches thick and maybe 2 feet deep and 1.5 feet wide. And they said, Michael, this amount of fentanyl can kill the entire population of the world, 7 billion people. Now, they have said to me, we do not get help from the feds on this. We're doing the best we can. If you're in office, and we know that now that we have 300 people a day dying from this fentanyl, if you know that this is happening and you don't do anything to stop it, what kind of human being are you? It's not a question of politics, not a question of Democratic or Republican. If my own brother was in office and doing this, I would go crazy on him. How do these people justify something like this? These are bad people to allow that to happen.
Well, and you say something, I could see that your reaction, is like, you're trying to figure out why, what, how could you do this? Why? And you said something before about this doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense because you're looking at it from the perspective of, you want a healthy country. And even though we may see views differently and, we're all still people, that's not what the agenda driven are doing. It makes actually perfect sense if you take the premise that the destruction is intentional, because look at the military. The military is now sitting around watching woke videos, ridiculous videos about pronouns. There's a potential nuclear war coming, World War III. And the military is in some of the worst shape it's been in a long time. They're not battle ready, but they can tell you what everyone's pronouns are. And they watched, a Blue's Clues video, looked like a video for a small child, and had to sit and obey. That's what's going on in the military. The southern border, this is how many years now of talking about, the cartels, what's happening to women, getting raped, the sex trafficking, the child trafficking, the horrors that have gone when drug cartels carry these people across the border, these people feeling like they've been incentivized, to engage in illegal activity because, if I get there, I'll be able to stay. Securing the border is doing everyone a favor. It protects the country because you can't monitor any of these people. You don't know, where are the drug dealers, what's coming through. But again, I'm saying if the destruction is intentional, it all makes sense. It all makes sense, because then what are the odds that people that are coming over that are in dire situations where are they going to lean? Are they going to be self-sufficient? Are they going to be contributing members of society, or are they going to have to lean on government? They're going to lean on government. And how do you think most Democrats feel, whether they're right or wrong? You can decide that for yourself. Those individuals will vote. So this is an agenda. These are agenda-driven decisions, and I hold Republicans accountable as well. Republicans don't do enough when they're in positions of power to make these changes. Do what you need to do, but it's every area of life. If you look at every area, whether it's the southern border, the military, it's weakness, and it's a refusal to do what needs to be done to protect and prioritize the people of this country. You look at these people who live in border towns and they're just destroyed. They're terrified. Their land is being ravaged. They're lost and no one cares. The people in DC and New York don't care until Greg Abbott decides to ship those individuals over to Martha's Vineyard. And then suddenly it's like, oh my gosh, well, we can't accommodate this. How horrible of them. Well, now you see the impact of not having a secure border. Well, guess what? Texas can't accommodate it either, but you're asking them to do it every day because you don't care. So it's a separate set of rules. It's like rules for thee, but not for me. And I think that's really hard for people to understand, just how deeply corrupt DC and New York media and politics is, which media and politics always holds hands, right? Because they're not in touch with the rest of the country, and they don't care. They don't care about those issues. They're too focused on, pronouns and woke nonsense and pro-abortion rallies, and they're not focused on actually fixing these problems. Because if you fix these problems and you do something positive for the country, you're going to have people who are able to take care of themselves, sustain themselves, and don't need big daddy government to come to their rescue. And that's not part of the plan.
How do you think we got to this point? I mean, after World War II, we had a real sense of patriotism in this country, and everything was going well after the war, and people were making money and things were really moving along. And then all of a sudden, at some point, the 60s became that crazy era. How do you think we got to this point to where, honestly, in my opinion, I think we're going down. I don't think we're going to make a switch and everything's going to be wonderful again. I think we're going down. 2 more years of this administration, if we don't take the midterms and try to at least, make Biden more benign than he is, I think we're really going to be in trouble 2 years from now.
Yeah, well, I mean, Biden's not going to run again. He doesn't even know where he is most of the time. But that's not to say there won't be somebody worse that steps in. I think Biden is relatively benign in light of what they actually have planned. So for me, I think there was a big change in the Obama years. And I think that people failed to really process what he was saying when he was talking about this fundamental transformation of America and these big moments of spreading the wealth around. And he was a very liberal guy. Look at Obamacare that came out. At the time, that was setting the template for things to come. The big debate back then was, can you mandate that somebody have health insurance? And people like me were saying, you can't do that because there might be a 22-year-old guy who doesn't need medical insurance. Why are you mandating that he, sign up for the same thing as somebody else with completely different risks and a completely different lifestyle? But they wanted this one size fits all stuff. And they needed to set the template for that in place for bigger things to come. Fast forward to now, and we're talking about, we've had conversations about mandates, COVID-19, getting into the, do you need to show you've got proof of vaccination to get into a restaurant so do you see how quickly that escalated? But I think the Obama years were the years where they needed to change the way people viewed the role of government in a big way. That Jill the Plumber moment of like, oh, when you spread your wealth around, it's good for everybody, was pivotal for him because there were a lot of people who thought, oh, well, that's great, actually. He appealed to them, and there were a lot of other people who recognized, well, you're talking about just taking somebody else's hard-earned cash, So that was a pivotal time, I think, to set in place this new way of viewing the role of government and this new way of viewing, the relationships between citizens and government. And Obama had a large appeal to the youth, which was integral because he needed those next generations to be on board with an ever increasing government expansion. And look where we are now. I mean, now that lends itself perfectly to a highly politicized FBI and a highly politicized DOJ, and the government being completely agenda driven, and a big government operation that can get you fired for not getting, an experimental drug, or, I mean, look where we are. So it doesn't happen overnight, but those were the years where the foundation was set for what we're seeing now. And I always say to people, okay, and what we're seeing now is going to be the foundation for what happens in 10 years. So think about that, because the slippery slope's getting awfully slippery.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, just with Obama, I was very disappointed in him initially. I met him in Florida one time, just by happenstance, on the beach. We were talking for 15 minutes, took a couple of photos that I got nailed about afterwards. How could you take a photo with Obama from all my friends? But I didn't know, he had given a brilliant speech at the Democratic National Convention. I said, wow, this is a bright guy. But I was really disappointed because I thought he had a chance to really make this country inclusive. He could have done a lot for race relations in this country, and he did just the opposite. He divided it even more. And that, among other things that he did, was very disappointing to me. But, I always say the root of the problem in America, in so many ways, is the breakdown of the family. And I really mean that. Jedediah, I spent, I think, so many years with young men coming into prison, 19, 20, 21 years old, mandatory minimum drug sentences. They got 20 years, they got to do 17 and a half, no more parole. And I used to counsel them, before I was a Christian, because I have an interest in kids. And you could have written the same script for every single one of them. Broken home, no father figure in the house, no mentor whatsoever. Mom, young mom, trying to do her best, a mess herself normally. They gravitate to the street, get involved with the local gangbanger who did the same thing. And the process goes on, and before you know it, they end up in prison. They have no guidance, and it's all the breakup of the family. And today, that's encouraged. It's encouraged. You don't need to be married. You don't need to be married. You don't need to have it's, in my view, the critically most important thing that led to the destruction of this country. That and moving away from God.
Yeah, we have an epidemic of fatherlessness in homes. Absolutely. Again, the destruction is intentional, right? Because you're saying it's glorified, right? Oh, you can be a single mom. You don't need a man. And this is no disrespect, by the way, to single moms, because some women find themselves in those predicaments through unfortunate circumstances, and they do an amazing job given a really difficult circumstance. But that's not the goal. That shouldn't be the goal. No, it shouldn't be. But it is the goal. Think about it again. If you have no dad in a home and you have a mom trying to make all of this happen, has a child, what are the odds? Do the odds go up or down that child is going to have to be put in state-run daycare, to be put in state-run schools, that you're going to have to delegate out? Because we don't live in those community cultures anymore. It's not like you're living communally where there's mom and dad and Aunt Betty and grandma and grandpa and everyone's around. That's not how we live anymore. So oftentimes these women that find themselves in those positions that are often glorified, like, oh, I'll just go to the sperm bank. I don't need a man. That's now a mantra of feminism. Oh, wear it on a t-shirt, honey, girl power, What happens then? She winds up taking that child, and it's hard. So she's trying to work, she's trying to put food on the table. That kid gets relegated to the state in many ways. And by that, I mean, public school. And what happens in those institutions? Indoctrination. You get the state-run message. You see what's going on in schools right now. I mean, it's not just liberalism. I used to talk about, liberalism in academia. No, now it's gender pronouns and, drag shows for kids in schools and drag queen story hour and, no parental consent for things that are happening in schools, medically and otherwise, and no parental consent. Your kid goes to school as a boy and the school acknowledges them as a girl all day long and doesn't tell you that that's going on. So again, what a great way to create a stooge of the state and not an independent minded person. And also, again, not having a dad and a mom in the home is problematic because mom and dad bring different things to the table in a home. So if you have a little girl, a little boy that doesn't have that stability, that security, and those really important values coming in from both mom and dad, what does that do? We talked about fatherlessness on my show, and I talked about how, young men that grow up with absentee fathers are way more likely to get involved in drugs and crime and go to jail. And there's just so many statistics. And yet it's being embraced by, cool woke society in 2022 at the expense of these kids. And there's financial risks that happen too, because it's hard raising kids is hard. And if you take one parent away, it's hard for that other parent, be it a single mom or a single dad. They know that. And they know that then you're more likely to become yourself more dependent on the state. So you really have to, it's the agenda is woven so deep. And if you really start to think critically about every issue in the country, that, think about the issue and then what's the real remedy to that? Well, more, good marriages and male and female unions that make sense and that are healthy, and, school choice to make the school system better, so that there's competition out there and the good schools rise to the top and the bad schools shut down if they have to, or they have to compete, and a secure border so that we actually know what's going on in our country and we don't incentivize lawlessness and incentivize trafficking and all of these things. If you think about the solution, you're going to find that there is one party in this country that repeatedly advocates for the opposite of what the solution would be. And you can't help but ignore it. I ask people to really just think critically about it. And if you're suspicious of the destruction is intentional argument, think critically about what's broken in America and what's been done. Have they made it better or worse? And why? Just think about it.
Well, your response to every issue that we've talked about today certainly shows that this is all intentional, without a doubt. One of the most horrible things to me was when the state actually thought they can interfere with a mom and their child and what authority mom has over her child in school. I thought it was horrible. I can't even fathom how they would think that way. Think of my wife. You try to interfere with the kids, forget it. You know that. But, in retrospect, it might have been a good thing because that awakens people to everything else that's going on. Now you're saying, okay, if they're willing to go this far and interfere with me raising my children and having something to say, what else are they going to do? And you get the women going in this country in that regard when it comes to their kids. I think it was great in that respect. Horrible what they tried to do, but it looks like the end result is really beneficial in every other way. So, but look, I could talk to you forever. I don't want to keep you that long. I really mean that. And there's so many other things we can get into. But let me ask you this. I'm a Christian. I put it out there all the time. I speak all over the world with respect to that, share my faith and my testimony. Do you see this country in a movement away from God? And if you do you think there's a way to bring it back? Do you think it's going to happen? Because listen, I'm strong in my faith, but I believe America is on a bad trajectory. I don't know if we're going to come back. I really mean that. I'm frightened about it for my kids and my grandchildren. I don't know if we're coming back.
I do believe that we're an increasingly secular country. And it's interesting. People will often, now the cool thing to say is I'm spiritual, and I always ask people when they say that, what does that mean to you? And they have a really hard time defining it. And I am someone who, I believe in God, but I also believe in, the force of the universe and the power of good. And I believe personally that even nature, the things that surround you in life that were created by God have a force of their own. You look up at a beautiful sky, it can transform your day. So, but we are increasingly secular. I do think though, that there are a lot of people out there who still feel really strongly about their faith. Even though the number is decreasing, I do believe that the people who stand by it, speak loudly, and have have so much power in their local communities to make an extraordinary difference. The thing is, though, so two points. Liberalism, to many liberals, is their religion. I remember dating a guy when I was younger who was very, very liberal, and he was not religious. And I remember asking him directly, how do you feel about religion? And he said, liberalism is my religion. And I never forgot that. And I think that's very true. I think you'll find that a lot of secular individuals oftentimes will align themselves with a lot of liberal causes. That's no mistake that that's happening. I always invite people to, I don't know how you bring people back to faith, but I think that what was really important for me, I went to Catholic school for many years, and it kind of turned me off in many respects because I saw a lot of hypocrisy. Like I saw, I had an amazing nun, but then there was a priest at my local church that I felt like just wasn't somebody that I felt I was scared of him. It wasn't somebody I would talk to, and that was not, by the way, my mom's experience growing up. She had a local church around her where she felt like they were like family. So I think it's so important to bring young people into really beautiful places of worship that do feel like family. And from a very young age, show them what that can bring to their life, because faith has the ability to take such an enormous weight off your shoulders. I think that having faith in something bigger than yourself gives you so much humility and brings a lot of humanity to the conversations we're talking about. One of the things that's missing as a result of this secularized country is that people forget each other's humanity. And that's what I saw happen with the mandates. I don't know if you saw that show that I did. I went back to The View, and I did a show, and I was getting shouted down because I had just made a different decision about the vaccine because of my experience, my health background. And I was shouted down, and I left that experience from, those were people who had been to my wedding in some cases, and I just thought, wow, people are losing their humanity in political discussions. And some of that, I think, comes from an increasingly secularized country where you forget that people are just people at the end of the day. So I always say, and I do it with my son, he's only 3 years old, but every night before bed, he gets down and he says a little thank you, and he calls him the man in the sky. We talk about what that means. And I say, bring that to your children young, and maybe they'll make a different decision as they grow older, and they come into their own. But faith can be such an incredible source of strength, and the world gets ugly. And it doesn't hurt to be grounded in something bigger than yourself. So I do feel hopeful if people do it right. I'm hopeful because I have a child and I see what I'm doing, and I know there's parents out there like me. But just know, the agenda will be to remove you from faith, because faith brings community. And faith brings relying on other people. And faith brings this perception that the other person is not the enemy. And when you relied on community and church and family, again, you relied less on government. And when you don't have that community and that faith, you lean more on government, and you're more likely to, again, it's all in the same direction. If you want the government and the state to be your religion, everything else has to go away. So just understand that, whether you're inclined to be religious or not, think about it in terms of community and how integral that is. And even look at COVID. I mean, if you looked back and just thought about it differently and said, they shut everybody down in their houses and kept them away from each other, which really enabled this, I'm afraid of you, you're the bad guy, you made a different decision from me. If that hadn't happened, and in many places it didn't happen, and people were allowed to really have these conversations, the shared humanity came through. And you realized, oh, that's just somebody making a different choice for their life. That's okay. So, but that doesn't prop up cable news and prop up all of these paradigms that rely on you to be mad and hate the other person. So I hope people can find a way to hold on to their faith and to invite children into that world, and to please preserve this sense of community where it exists. Because without it, where does that single mom with the child turn to? They turn to the government, and the government's not the answer, but community certainly can be. So that's my message.
No, and you're so right about that. I have a platform where I do some personal coaching, and we have something called the Inner Circle. And we got a couple hundred people in there. And one of the byproducts of that, which I didn't even realize, is that they all thank me for creating this community among them where they're all able to prop each other up, talk to each other, encourage one another. And I've heard it so much more lately that people want to be part of a community. They want to belong to something. And I think maybe that's been taken away. I didn't even realize that, in my daily life, but I think people are sensing that that's being taken away. And, look, I grew up as a Catholic. I had some experiences like you had. Those priests could have been very rough. The nuns, I mean, they didn't spare the rod at all back then. You get away with that, But, worshiping now in a Christian church, when you have the right atmosphere, the right pastor, the right worship team, the right community, it's so healthy and so wonderful for people. If we had more of that, we'd have less of the troubles that we have. But you're right, because we have a government and people in power that don't want to promote an agenda like that, a faith agenda. And I don't like to use the word religion, people get crazy with it, but a faith agenda, we would have a different result in this country. But anyway, I have to say this. I don't disagree with anything that you said. As a matter of fact, you say a lot of things better than I could, and it was really a pleasure being able to speak to you. I hope we do it again. Maybe I'll come on your show one time. Who knows? And you can grill me a little bit. I don't know about things, but
yes, I would love that. You are welcome anytime. I thoroughly enjoyed this, and thank you so much.
Well, there you have it. I really enjoyed that interview. I hope you listened and listened closely to what she had to say. Strong, independent, intelligent woman, not threatened by a man being a man. I have to say that. Just her perspective on life, on critical issues was so spot on. I don't think I disagreed with anything that she said. And that's unusual. I usually have disagreements, but she was terrific. So listen to her. She has her own podcast. She's part of the Valuetainment, Patrick Bet-David, household there. So enjoy it and tune into her. She has so many great things to say, but I hope you really enjoyed this interview. I certainly did, and maybe we'll do it again one time. So how do I always leave you? Same way. Be safe, be healthy. And Jedediah said it today, be safe. Ladies, be safe. A lot of stuff going out there in the world that's just horrible. You got to protect yourself. Be healthy. I mean this from the bottom of my heart. God bless every one of you. And yes, I'll see you next time. Take care.